Welcome to Zen Bites, a series of audio recordings on Zen Buddhism, mindfulness meditation, spirituality and psychology, featuring Zen Buddhist teacher Martin Goodson and Jamie Shavdia, a mindfulness-based psychotherapist and psychological trainer. The following conversation was recorded in December 2014 in association with the website The Zen Gateway and Jamie's own website, jamieshavdia.co.uk. So if it's time to take a break, sit back, relax, and disappear into the conversation. Okay, so welcome to Zen Bites 8. And I think we've got quite a good discussion lined up for you today. We're going to be looking at working with the emotional household, which I'm sure you're aware is quite a big topic, not only in secular mindfulness, but also very much in the Buddhist sphere as well. Or dare I say religious sphere, working with the fires, the passions, the emotions. And later I think we're going to be looking at kind of what we even mean by that. But before we get going with today's topic, I think you wanted to just update us with the gateway.
Yes, okay, just make a quick announcement again that if you want to join in the discussion or you would like to suggest topics for Jamie and myself to talk about in future podcasts, please do get in touch. The email again is thezengateway@gmail.com. That's thezengateway@gmail.com, or you can go over to www.thezengateway.com to the online community under groups, look for Jamie Shavdia, and you can join in there. Okay, so we'll continue on with our subject for today, working with the emotional household. And I think, Jamie, perhaps first of all, it might be useful just to see if we can define or say something about that phrase, emotional household.
Yeah, so what do we even mean by this emotional household? Well, we, as human beings, we are very emotional creatures. And I think I'd be quite interested, at least to start off by looking at there being some kind of distinction between head and heart. Certainly from a clinical perspective, we can delineate kind of cognition in the head and kind of the emotions within the body. So, as we've said on previous podcasts, by thoughts we're particularly reflecting on images or pictures within the mind. Sometimes they can appear as sort of short video clips, or perhaps a voice in your head, like an inner dialogue, which then triggers something within the body as a whole. So that could be, there's a whole host of emotions there. So it could be the more animated of the emotions. So if we're talking negative emotions, you might be things like anger, rage, hatred, malice, or it might be the more softer emotions, but maybe even more destructive, so sort of depression or sort of the lower energy emotions. And then you have the slightly more abstract emotions. So when you're in something like rational emotive behaviour therapy, they will actually go as far as saying something like jealousy or envy is an emotion as well. Which is quite interesting because we're not really then working so much with an energy, but more with a kind of a cognitive perception. So I know in REBT they draw this distinction between jealousy and envy, where jealousy would be particularly a romantic or sexual jealousy towards a partner. For example, if someone's partner was speaking to somebody else, that would be particularly relevant to jealousy, where envy might be you have a better car than me and I don't like that.
Yeah.
And then of course that has a repercussion in the body. So I guess what I think we should start off by saying is that what we mean by the emotional household is a very varied thing. That's my initial take on it. What would you think?
Well, I think that is quite a nice exposition on it, because it brings the two parts that make up our experience of emotions very much to the fore. One is something that's felt, and the other is the cognitive side to it, and those two, inevitably go together. And I know that when we're going to be shortly, when we talk about working with the emotions, that making that distinction about what arises physiologically in the body, and then that whole series of cognitions that sort of goes with it, that not only expresses it but also exacerbates and can keep it going. You know, particularly when we start ruminating.
Yeah.
Clearly, those two sides are two sides of the same coin. So I think that very much comes in. I just wanted to sort of say one of the things that I can't remember where I read it, but I remember somebody making the point about the connection between the word emotion and its root derivation to motivate, emotion. They have the same root because actually that's what an emotion, that's the purpose, if you like, of an emotion, isn't it? It's to force us into some kind of action. To get something, to get rid of something, to get something back, to drive something away, or whatever it may be, or to stop us. And I think the other thing is that certainly one of the things that, from my own experience, once a person starts working with the emotions directly in whatever field, your definition of the term emotion really does begin to expand. I mean, the very florid emotions, as you said, like anger or lust or jealousy or something like that, can be very obvious. But some of the ones that you also mentioned, like depression or lethargy or procrastination, you wouldn't automatically connect that with an emotional state or an emotional household. But when we're working with the emotions, those are included as well. Things like opinionatedness. Things like this, which are highly emotive. We know that there are some subjects you just can't talk to him about because he just sets him off. So don't mention the war, whatever it might be. So these things are obviously are vehicles for the emotions too. So it's a very wide gamut. I think for me personally, if I was going to sort of try and sort of tie it up, I regard anything as emotional that has some kind of obsessive element or a compulsive element, something either the mind keeps going back to it, like for example, so when we're sitting in meditation, and we're giving ourselves into the breath or the count on the breath or the mantra or whatever it is, and the mind keeps wandering off to something that's happened earlier, or to just that sort of that has an emotional element to it because it's driven, it's unconsciously driven, and emotions come out of the unconscious. And a compulsive element as well. So when if somehow I feel compelled to do something, so for example, if I have to sit still in a room and not do anything, and I fidget, and I tried and stop myself fidgeting, and the next moment my mind wanders and I'm fidgeting again. That's a slight compulsive element. I mean, again, we wouldn't normally say these are emotions, but they certainly belong in that realm because of that compulsive or obsessive element. So that's normally what I'm thinking of when I think of emotional household as well.
Absolutely, and I think the when we look at sort of the central principle of a lot of what we talk about on Zen Bites, and indeed in Zen, is this imaginary ego, this imaginary I or me. So within that I or me, when one is consumed within it and believes one is it, that comes with a whole host of habits and compulsions. So if one is deeply, habitually an angry character,
yes,
then that will keep coming out over and over and over again until it's really addressed. Which is why people have success in therapy. Maybe someone goes for CBT because their CBT, sorry for our listeners, cognitive behavioural therapy, which works with thoughts and behaviours to affect emotions, is that you would then look at the cycles and you would look at what thought leads on to this emotion.
And you analyse it down. In other words,
and you look at what you're telling yourself in that moment and how then you react to the feeling and so on. So from a kind of a management perspective, something like CBT or REBT is very, very powerful to get towards psychological health. We're working with the troublesome emotions. But I guess and we're very interested to talk about that in this discussion because clearly I work in that field as a psychotherapist. But one of the major things I'd really like to talk about today is also the Buddhist kind of principle of the transformative effect of the powerful energies as well. So maybe that's something we can talk about later.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I mean, because that's central, and of course that comes from a purely Buddhist context, and it might just be useful to highlight that because obviously there are differences in the context, to my knowledge, between the sort of Buddhist framework and the secular mindfulness framework, although they obviously overlap and are interrelated. But because in Buddhism, going back to those Four Noble Truths, the cause of suffering, the way out of suffering, the cause of suffering, the Buddha highlighted as attachments, what he called attachments in the heart. In particular, the attachment to the notion of I, me and mine, to myself. And the ending of suffering is the release from those attachments, or the grinding away, the dropping away of those attachments, and that's the transformation. And of course, the only power, Buddhistically, the only power that can do that are the emotions themselves. So that the delusion of I, which the Buddha said that I am a delusion, is the only way that can wear away that sense, that feeling of I and consciousness, is are bearing the emotional powers themselves. And so the whole context of working with the fires is based on that, that the emotional forces are the only force in the universe, if you like, that can actually have any impact on that delusion of I. And when that lays down, that's the transformation we're talking about. It's where consciousness becomes free of the sensation, or free of the perception of an I.
Yeah, and I think a very interesting differentiation then is the difference about repression and suppression then.
Yeah.
Because clearly, being good social citizens, if you're going to get angry in a public place, for example, that's a social taboo. So you can't get angry, so therefore you have to inhibit that. Mm-hmm. I think it's the prefrontal lobe at the front of the brain, which is kind of responsible on an evolutional level to kind of stop us from acting out imminently on our anger or something like that. In fact, I think that's why a lot of sort of intoxicants like anger and so on, for many people, can actually challenge that prefrontal lobe inhibitor, because it relaxes it. So the thing that already stops us from saying things or doing things
has itself been stopped.
Yes, and then therefore people are more prone to fighting and shouting and so on when they're drunk, for example. So there is this aspect of, at least when that prefrontal lobe is working and you're in your sort of daily educated self, that there is a tendency to repress the anger and kind of live with it. But as we all know, that especially if that anger is particularly a problem, then for some people with anger management issues, then repression isn't going to work. And of course that can cause a lot of problems in itself. People can, through stress and repressed anger. I have so many clients where their central problem is repressed anger, and it goes way back.
Right.
And it comes up in all sorts of things. It turns up in irritable bowel syndrome and various different things. So repression is no good either. So this is where we need to start to work towards more suppression in the sort of the religious training sphere of Zen. I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, I think that's a very, very important point, because I think a certain sort of, and I will use the term pop psychology from a certain era, believed that somehow letting every impulse out was the way to go, and that this was extremely healthy. Actually, it's not healthy at all. Unmanaged impulsiveness actually breaks down the ability to be able to bear one's own emotional state.
And hitting cushions and these kind of things.
All this sort of stuff, or shouting and so on.
Is that primal scream therapy, I think?
There is a primal, I don't know whether it's the same thing as that, but certainly I think it comes from that sort of milieu. But again, this is why I think that looking at, recognising that what an emotion is trying to do is to get us to act in some way. When that emotion comes up, physically in the body, it's felt as uncomfortable. it can be uncomfortable feeling, and the stronger the emotional impulse, the more uncomfortable it becomes, and the reason for that is that it becomes so unbearable that I then am forced to act. That's the compulsive side of it. I'm compelled to act. So I scream, or I yell, or I slam the door, whatever it is. I can't bear it anymore. The other opposite side of that, as you said, is the repression, where I simply refuse to feel it. But that doesn't mean it goes away. It means it comes out in those awkward ways, like you said, with whether it's a depression or whether it's hives, or whether it's irritable bowel syndrome, or many of those other ways. That's the skin disorder, the whole somatic thing, psychosomatic thing, is there. So those two sides are not there at all. The middle way, if you like, and again, yes, this is from the Buddhistic point of view. The middle way is to be able to allow that emotion to come up into the body, so it's felt, and come into consciousness, so it's felt. It fills us, but without bursting the container.
Yes.
We have, for our containment, we have the precepts, obviously, which are, you can look those up, but there's basically just good
ethical guidelines,
which keeps us from the worst excesses of emotional damage, but also good form as well. So things like, just being simple, well-mannered, being a good social being, as it were, without exploding. And that this is something that protects others and oneself. Interestingly, the Chinese used to call the precepts the protections, because they protect us from the excesses of the emotions. They stop us being rash, they stop us doing something we later regret, and they stop us damaging others as well. So hence they were called the protections. And I think that gives quite a good connotation. So we have this halfway thing. We have this ability, this inner strength. What we're cultivating is this inner strength to be able to bear that emotional energy in consciousness without letting it out and without repressing it. And it's precisely that middle way that undermines or dissolves, if you like, burns away the delusion of I. And the reason that this delusion of I is problematical is that without a feeling of I, these emotions cannot manifest themselves, because all emotional reactions are geared towards the sense of I. Either I want something, or I want rid of something, I'm frightened of it, or I want to destroy it.
Yes. And I mean, just going back to there's a slight subtlety as well. So when that anger arises, for example, let's take anger. When that rage or that anger arises, or sometimes that unhealthy anger, there is a tendency to, as you say, either repress it because it's socially unacceptable, and you have the psychosomatic reaction, or for it to come out and be possessed by it. And in that possession, I mean, possession is quite a good word.
It's a very accurate
almost
word.
Like the Exorcist kind of, it possesses you, and then I am not myself. So therefore I act out in terms of bad behaviours or unhelpful behaviours, or I'll say the wrong thing. So in that moment of consumption, I am lost. So we're trying to come away from and become more mindful and more aware of that moment where you get consumed. So we don't allow that kind of trail of destruction and negative karma to be built up. So as you say, with suppression, then we're allowing that emotional energy, that feeling to arise within the body, but holding it with a certain awareness without it spilling all over the place.
Yes.
So, I mean, our own Zen teacher, and a good Zen teacher will often then, in training a monk or a lay Buddhist to handle those emotions better, will often deliberately try and stir those up.
Indeed.
And when those are stirred up through various different strategies, shall we say, the student is then forced to meet them, and to learn how to deal with them, and that is very different from just learning how to rationalise or logically work your way out of it, because it's felt and actually really trying to work with that, which is a whole different thing. So that leads us on to this kind of major point here, which is, and I think this is a really big point between sort of secular mindfulness, sort of Mark Williams, John Kabat-Zinn school of what you see in mindfulness groups now, as opposed to something like Zen or the way we were trained originally, is that emotion, and this goes against completely sort of social ideas, is not a bad thing. In fact, that rage should be praised because it is an energy which is highly valuable, and if it's used in the right way, can be very transformative.
Yes.
But when held in awareness,
yes.
Which means then that the energy that arises within the body is not the problem. The problem is the mask that energy is wearing. And the mask is, to use more CBT language, would be the way you think about it, or the way the cognitions that you have around it. So the way that you would perceive that rage. So usually in unhealthy anger, someone has breached your version of ethical code, your guidelines. So your guideline for life might be, no one will ever touch my vehicle.
Yeah.
As in no one, and somebody comes along and keys your car.
Yes, exactly.
And that has breached your rule that at some point in your life as that you've set up. So, and then of course you explode into a rage because someone has gone against you in the way that you and then of course when you're consumed by that rage, you then tend to think of more past times when you were angry.
Yeah.
Because it's contextually driven.
Yes.
And then you're off with your anger narrative and you're consumed by it. So the mindfulness allows us to kind of stand back and observe that has been triggered and that's happening. So you have this external trigger. It's been now you're in the midst of a reaction.
Yes.
And of course reactivity is a big thing we play with here. So that is one part of it. And from a sort of a secular mindfulness perspective, that's all well and good because it helps people to deal with their thoughts and their anger management. But I think one thing that kind of clinical secular mindfulness completely misses, and I'll go as far as saying that it completely misses the fact that the energy that's underneath that, from a religious perspective, has a tremendous opportunity to burn away the myth of I.
Yes, and what's more, actually, the emotional household, sometimes called the passions too, are seen as having a divine or highly spiritual element to them, which they do because they're the tremendous energy of life. I mean, when you were speaking, I was reminded of that quote of Master Hakuin, the 18th century Japanese Zen master, who said, "Anger certainly is a defiling passion. But when that precious energy arises, do not waste it." So yes, it's seen, if you like, as a poison, but a poison that can also become a medicine, like many poisons are medicines, used in the right way.
Alchemy.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is something that's tremendously important, and I think this is very much so. There's a great danger in working with the emotional households to literally demonize them. They're already shadowy elements because they make us do things of which we're not proud, or because they trouble us and hurt those that we love. That we tend to sort of blame them. As you know, in the big analogy, the great training analogy in Zen Buddhism is the bull and the herdsman, sometimes called the ox and the herdsman, but bull is sort of better because it's a bit more capricious, a bit wilder, whereas the ox is a sort of tamed creature that's used to pull plough, or was used to pull ploughs, etc. So where the bull represents all that very powerful impulsive energy, elemental energy, and the herdsman represents this sort of humanizing aspect. Yes, the danger is to literally put horns on that bull, devil's horns on that bull, and that's only to exacerbate the problem. Because the bull has been kept down often for a long time anyway. Mm-hmm. And when students come into Zen training, certainly, I mean, it'll be slightly different for yourself because obviously you're dealing with specifically with people who have certain problems, and of course their emotions are going to be directly involved. A number of people who come into Zen training may not have any specific issues. They're just interested in enlightenment or koans or something like that. But actually, as it turns out, you realise that these people don't feel their emotions, or they may seem quite cut off from them. They may seem very rationalistic. They never sort of seem to get upset.
Well, certainly in depression, I mean, that's a big thing. When people become very depressed,
yes, of course,
they often report numbness.
Yes,
they
absolutely, can't feel anything at all. And of course, in the training, this is precisely why the master then may well start provoking them in order to produce that reaction. And of course, the thing is that that numbness itself is an emotional reaction, but it's often just not recognised.
Yes.
You know, like the feeling of dislocation, or the feeling of alienation, or the feeling of having no reactions to things that other people seem to be reacting to, and yet I feel, you know, almost like there's a screen between me and life.
Well, it's dissociation.
Dissociation.
So there's repression to the max, where
absolutely
it's a defence mechanism. So if you repress all of your anger or your sadness so much so, then of course there's that numbness has a purpose, it has a value.
Yes, it does.
Because it obviously just allows you to kind of carry on, but it's just a very unpleasant life, and you're not
bland,
and you're not experiencing the full emotional households.
Exactly, because, and that's the other side, you know, that state of blandness, that state of alienation is itself an emotional state, but it goes unrecognised. And so, you know, from a Buddhistic point of view, that is a fire that to be worked with. Once we start working with the fires, and this is the interesting thing, once we start really working with the fires, what begins to happen is that we begin to feel them much more intensely. And in fact, I know people who've come up after particularly say something like a retreat, who said they suddenly realise that the fires are there all the time, maybe not in a conflagration, but almost like a gas mark 1, you know, just on a sort of low light, but they can really feel it now, and suddenly they can feel the reactivity in their own bodies and their own being, and that's a really good sign. Yes. When that's coming up, because now people really begin to feel alive. That energy, which is, we can't really call it emotions like jealousy or lust anymore, because it's the energy that informs lust and anger and jealousy and all those things. It enables us to touch life and to feel alive, and to experience our ordinary life in a much more informed way, because emotions do inform us. You know, they're informational channels, but also give us the experience really of being alive. And this is the effect of that transformation. So that the attachment to I is that separation, that feeling of alienation. But when that's softened, then the feeling of being alive and being given into life is, you know, comes much more to the fore.
Absolutely. So there is a moment where that anger arises, and we'll stick with the example of anger because it's quite an animated one, but there's a moment of whether I react or I don't react, and I think that's really, that middle way is so important, because that's where the skill comes. Because even if you've done lots and lots of mindfulness classes, or even a lot of training, Zen training, we're still all vulnerable to that point where someone has done something, or something has happened, whatever that may be, that just sets us off. And you have to be able to catch it in that moment, and that's the real art, because then it's either, right, do I use this as a spiritual opportunity to transform, or do I get carried away by it? With more and more daily life practice, we start to realise where those triggers are.
Yeah, and actually the point of the mindfulness practice is really to highlight where those are, because when the passions, as you said, when the passions possess us, when we're taken over by them, we are forgetful, and we are no longer really aware either, not fully, until after the passion has exhausted itself. And this is why if there's no point thinking, right, okay, I've got a really bad temper, I'm going to work with that, because the temper's so big, as soon as it comes up, bang, it just carries us away completely. So the starting point of working with the fires is to start with the little fires. And a good way to do that is to just develop, from a mindfulness practice point of view, is to just develop, a new habit. There's the old adage, when this Zen monk first went up to the training monastery and said to the master, "Can you give me any advice that I can carry through all the way through my training?" And he said, yes. Two things. One, always say yes to everything. Of course, this is a monastic environment. And number two, always walk noiselessly. And because if one tries to walk noiselessly, I'll forget. And when do I forget? I forget when I'm obsessing about something, or when I'm caught up in something and I'm hotly off on something, and that's when the footsteps get noisy, or I slam the door, or I bang the fridge, or I bump into something, that sort of thing. If we then become aware of the effects of the emotional household, that acts as the reminder to practice restraint. And then suddenly we feel it. As soon as we practice restraint, suddenly we can actually feel the emotional impact in the body. But it's a small one. Like if, for example, if I'm in a hurry, there's a little bit of anxiety there. I don't realise there's some anxiety there until I have slammed the front door, and it suddenly reminds me that was a rather mindless act, and I sort of just pull myself together, and I can feel it now in the chest. I can feel there's a sort of sense of urgency. So now there is the mindfulness of that urgency. That's all that's needed. We then just, in that contained way, we can just walk down the street, and we are containing that anger, which just lasts. Containing that impatience, which just lasts a brief period, but it's there. And that's how we begin to work. That sensitizes consciousness to the presence of the emotional household, and also allows us to contain it, to build up that bearing strength. And once we can do that comfortably, a bit like training for a marathon, once you can run 500 yards, you can run 600 yards, and so on, and that begins to build up, and that's how we start that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe we have to be, at least from my personal subjective experiences, we have to be slightly careful with this wording containment, because containment as a word can sometimes, for some people, suggest kind of being held in or trapped in, where to a certain extent, yes, it's contained as in we don't allow it to
drive us anyway.
To drive us and be thrown out, and then you shout and you hit out or something like that. But at the same time, with the transformation of this energy, there isn't a feeling of that energy coming into the body and having nowhere to go. Actually, it does feel like it kind of can come out, but it's not. I'm just being pernickety here. Obviously.
No, it's a good point.
I mean, it almost is in kind of like, the opening up of the crown chakra or something like that. Kind of this opening up, this transcendental experience of which can happen actually in spiritual training when you go beyond I, and that's really. What I find so interesting is the elusive I, the separation of the separate self, the separative psyche. Then that's what most people are trapped in. So the anger can act as a fire to burn away I. I mean, there's the Andrew San's, Miyoki Oni's saying was always. I am still here, the fire still burns, burn me away. So that the fire, the anger, actually has a purpose to dissolve the rigidity of an I, and then therefore this body can experience something beyond that fake limit. And that's that energy arising upwards.
Yeah, I mean, what's to put that really concretely, because I think that is a very important point, that energy does have something to do. And what it does, what it's actually burning away, when we say it's burning away I, what it's burning away is the view I have. So just to go back to the example of slamming the front door and realising that I'm now in a rush and feeling slightly anxious, having contained that energy, walking down the street, suddenly occurs to me that I left it right to the last minute before going to the loo, putting my coat on, getting my bag ready and leaving. Hence, I'm feeling anxious. Suddenly, what's come out of that is that I like leaving things to the last minute, or for some reason I didn't. Perhaps the destination where I've got to go is not something I particularly want to do, so I was slightly putting it off. So what comes out of it is that when that, having contained that impatience or having contained that anxiety, it just falls away. Suddenly the vista opens and we see the chain of events that led to that emotional state being provoked in the first place. And this is why, again, as you said, the point you made before about the emotional household is not seen as something evil, it's informative. It responds, it's a channel of information. And when an emotional state comes up, or when we're given a problem because of an emotional state, that happens, there's something to pay attention to. This is news, this is information that's coming in. And quite often it's information I don't want to see as well. Yes. And the burning away of I means that it is seen.
Yes, and that allows for inquiry and the ability to gain insight.
Totally. And just looking, we run out of time, we're going to overshoot otherwise, so I think maybe we can draw that rather fulsome discussion there. There's obviously a lot of points that any of which could probably produce its own programme, and maybe will in the future, but for now I think maybe we should leave it there. Yeah,
and hopefully we've stirred up some emotions to get you to go and find out a bit more of your own research.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you again for next month's Zen Bites 9.
Thank you.
Okay, so that completes another Zen Bites, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. But in the meantime, if you would like to check out either of our websites, you can go to the zengateway.com website for the Zen Bites community, or you can go to Jamie's individual website, www.jamieshavdia.co.uk.